Today we're going to look at classroom dialogue and learning. And yes, rather ironically, I'm going to give you a mini lecture on it. So take that and think about that for a while. All right. Today's goals, I really want to make sure that we identify why discourse is important in literacy learning in particular, and then I want you to begin to explore how teachers can prepare students to enter into discourse with informational text. So we think about that in discourse. They have between each other, they have with the text themselves. Okay, so before we begin, I just wanted to stop and have us all remember this video that we watched in preparation for this lecture. And many of us, well, I know that many of us are teaching grades very different than the grades in this particular video, and our students are going to need different kinds of supports. What I think we found was most of us walked away with a appreciation for just the abilities of the student, an appreciation for how much the students were willing and able to take sort of control or agency of their own learning. And I think that that's really where we want to focus ourselves. Yes, it's going to look very different if I'm teaching the little guys than when I'm teaching somebody like in this particular video. But there's a lot of advantages for us to consider what the expectations are as our students are aging out of our grades and out of our grade bands and into the next level, and to be thinking, I mentioned before, I'm very much a backwards design type of person, and that's one of the things that I think where I hope I bring something fresh to this program, which is because that experience with the older students has allowed me to and has shaped me a bit. But so I want you to think about that, and I want you to think about just how powerful of an example that was of what our students can do. Then I want you to think about this. 85% of classroom talk is teacher-directed talk. 85% of the time that our students are in the classroom, the teacher is either directing the talk and sort of eliciting a quick reply from the students, or the teacher is talking. When we look at teacher talk, we look at what we call the IRE, the initiate, response, evaluate, is the model that dominates classroom discussion. What does that look like? I ask a student something. I ask a student, okay, what did the reading say last night about blank? The student responds, and then I evaluate the response. And what that does is it kind of puts me in control of the conversation, and it really makes the conversation really much more about being right. So we want to think about what are some ways that we can initiate conversation in the classroom that's on a much more of a continuum, right? So what are some things that we can ask our students to do rather than just responding to a question and then having us tell them if they got that question right or wrong, or whether or not we agree, having us evaluate their question. And so, we can think of this in terms of a continuum. And so a lot of you, when you were looking at that video, were thinking, well, that couldn't happen in my classroom because my little guys are too young, or maybe I've got students with special needs, or maybe my discipline is so different. And I get that, but there are probably things within this continuum that we can look at and that you can consider adding. And so the first thing is we want to talk about learning talk. And learning talk is really trying to get our students to be asking questions and to be open to the content that we're giving. And so learning talk is when we ask our students to do things like narrate or explain, question, answer, speculate, imagine, explore, evaluate, argue, and justify. Can't you see how so many of those would engage your student far more than answering a question in an IRE response, right? I want to get them learning that content, not just like on the basic knowledge level, but I want them to be thinking about that content. I want them to be, analyzing it. I want them to be evaluating that content for themselves. Once the students move from that learning talk, now I can ask them to start to kind of engage in some teaching talk. And the teaching talk allows them to kind of start to process and make sense of the learning that they're doing. And so those are when I ask them to do things like list, recite, instruct, share. Those are things where I'm asking them to take their learning, and they say, if you can teach something, you really know it. And then from there, I can move them into interactive discourse. Because when we're in an interactive discourse, our students both have to have learned and they have to be able to explain their thinking. So they have to have some components of the learning talk, they have to have some components of the teaching talk. And in the interactive discourse, this is where I can start to now lead the kids into whole class pupil led. It can use both learning and teaching talk, but it's just not directed by the teacher. And so that's what you saw was that interactive discourse. You saw that in that video. What you didn't necessarily see were the things that the teacher did before that video that engaged the students in some learning talk and some teaching talk so that they were ready, to be for that student-directed interactive discourse. Okay. I put this Captain Obvious here for a reason, because the more a teacher uses the talking time up themselves, the less the students can talk, right? Teacher talk tends to be very rote. It tends to be very basic. When we think about Bloom's taxonomy, it tends to be in the lower levels. It's about recitation. It tends to look at exposition or instruction. We tell students what to think, or we tell them what to do. We tend to discuss for them, like this is what I'm thinking about. So, and then, on a very, very small level, this probably should almost be like a pyramid, and this should be the top of the pyramid. Teacher talk, teacher-led talk, can be part of a dialogue between teacher and student. And that's where it's going to be the most effective, is when you can get your students dialoguing with you. Maybe discussing with you, but certainly dialoguing with you as a learner to learner, if you will. So true literacy inquiry occurs when students are asked to transact with a text as a conversant. They talk to the text. They think about what the text is saying, but then they think about their own experiences and they try to bring those two together. And it's going to be somewhat tense, right? And even conflict between conversants, between self and others, as one voice refracts another. That's why, you see these, text to self, text to world. Text to self sometimes is going to be filled with tension, because maybe that student's experiences is very different from the text that you bring before them. Maybe that student's opinions are very different than the author that they bring before them. But it's really, really important that we create space in our classrooms for our students to understand that that's actually what they're supposed to be doing when they're reading. That's actually part of their job as a reader. It's important for us to think. Bakhtin is a very, very complex, very theoretical, full education philosopher. So what I'm going to share with you is a very dumbed down version of Bakhtin and what he calls his great dialogue and the circles of dialogue. But it's the way that I've come to understand it, and hopefully it'll help you in a way that isn't so mired in the philosophical and is a little bit more about what I can do as a teacher. So Bakhtin was an education philosopher, and he had this idea of what he called the great dialogue. And he talked about dialogue as being a circle. And that circle both shapes our thinking and is shaped by our thinking. So we're constantly building the circle. And in that circle, in the center of the circle, are the texts. I guess not in the center, actually, as part of the circle, so they're one of the pencils, are the texts that shape our great dialogue. So even though I might be reading something in social studies class, I might have read something in science class, or I might have read something in English class, or even I might have read something at home or seen something. It's 2020, right? So it's a 2020, so we could have about text as far as, commercials, advertisements, movies, TV shows, any of those things. But they're all come into this conversation, and so I both shape that circle, and I'm shaped by the circle. So my thoughts are shaped by what I have read and what I have, what texts I have conversed with before, and I shape the text, which is an important part. So this idea, we don't have a fixed meaning to a text, okay? So the quality of learning then is limited by the quality of student talk, because student talk, that discourse, is part of what shapes my thinking. So I'm both shaped by the discourse and I shape the discourse, okay? So very, very complex, but basically what Bakhtin is warning us is that teachers need to help our students to do two things. We need them to consider what the author meant. So we do need to teach authorial intent, but we also need to make space for our students to respond to that authorial intent and to bring into the conversation with other things that they know and have experienced as learners, both in school and outside of school, I would argue. So what does that mean? What do we look like as a teacher? Teachers then act in a classroom that values discourse. We act as discourse guides. And so we want to provide questions that really can get to the content, but leave room for discussion and can be linked to later assessments. So I loved this example. This was an example when I was looking at inquiry-based learning. In a seventh grade science class, there might be an essential question might be something like, what is the reproductive cycle? Kind of a boring question, right? And so this education consultant worked with a science teacher, seventh grade science teacher, to talk about how do I make that a little bit more student-centered? How do I make that a little bit more discussion-oriented? And so they came up with this question. So they moved from what is the reproductive cycle and why does it matter to is sex necessary for life? And that good question, in the piece that I worked at, that question really drove. It got to the heart of the content, which was the reproductive cycle, but it left room for discussion, and it left room for that discussion to be linked to later assessments, left room for that to be linked to other disciplines, to other classes, to other experiences that the student may have brought into the classroom or take from the classroom. Okay, I'm going to just show you a very short piece on classroom culture of discourse.
There's a culture of public discourse in classrooms in which this stuff really gets results. And children have two responsibilities. They have to speak up so people can hear you, and they have to listen and expect to be listened to. How many students in our classes, when they say something, it's me, teacher, teacher, student, teacher, student, teacher, student. That's the dynamics of most classroom discourse. Teacher, student, teacher, student, teacher, student. And when it's teacher, student, and if it's teacher, student, sleepy time for everybody else, because it's this. There's no expectation that anybody's going to have anything to say about it. This business of the idea of these fractals, or the idea of a hologram where whatever's going on with adults is also going on with children. Most of us are not great listeners. Some people are born great listeners, but most of us have to learn how to listen well. And most staff meetings, most grade level meetings, somebody dominates, somebody shuts down. You've got all kinds of stuff going on. Attending to these things and giving each other tools to work with can launch the conversation. This is a kind of a playful tool. It allows us to own our stuff, And it also works with kids. I've worked with kids as young as second grade. I've had to change the language a little bit when I work with kids that young, but all the way through high school, adults, coaches, teachers, whatever. Tools like this can launch a conversation to get us to agree to certain norms or to rethink how we're actually talking to each other. What we were working on was getting kids to hear each other, to start to attend to each other. You can hear how hard that is. You can see how hard that is because they're not used to expecting to have to pay attention to what another student says. The idea that you have to repeat something and repeat it, most people think that's insane. I don't have time to do that. If you don't do that, your kids are not learning. You're getting through the curriculum, but you don't have any real evidence of learning. What happens in most classrooms is once a kid gives the right answer, we move on. We don't know why they gave the right answer. We don't know if everybody else has the same thinking or agrees with the answer or not, but we heard what we wanted to hear, so move on. That's what teaching is most of the time. My advice, slow down. Slow down. And find out Who heard what? So the basic beginning moves, if you want to work teachers to begin to work on this, if they're convinced that talk is important and frustrated because they can't get it going, then here's what you do. The first thing a teacher needs to learn to do is, no matter what a kid says when you ask the question, you ask them further questions like, why do you think that? Or tell me how you got that? Or say more about that. Any phrase that will get the kid to tell you what they're thinking, whether the answer is right or wrong. Because we have to help the teachers get away from the right answer nonsense too. It's not about right answers. It's about developing reasoning and the capacity to articulate and communicate. 2, the simplest, easiest move, and one a lot of middle school and high school teachers are afraid of, is turn and talk. Restating by students. The teachers are doing the work. The teachers are doing the learning. That's it. Who's ever doing the work is doing the learning. And finally, the teacher at moments revoices things. So there are reasons why a teacher would revoice, but it's not the beginning and it's not every time. It's when the kids are now at a place where they've been grappling with an idea and we need to give it some clarity. We need to highlight the idea. So those are the 3 or 4 beginning moves of starting to get talk going in a classroom. Any video will get you conversation. Looking for videos where you have great talk so people start to have images of what it looks like, and also images of regular everyday type classrooms so you can compare and contrast them and start to have discussions, dialogue, debates about how important is this talk thing and how much are we willing to invest in getting it to happen in our classrooms. If you don't think it's important, then don't bother. Go on to something else. I want to speak for 2 seconds on this, like the cycle, it's not really a cycle so much as the stages that people go through as they start to get in these collaborative groups. The whole teaching profession for the last 100 years has been individual preference, basically, and we work by ourselves in isolation. So you got 100 years of history here, probably more, and not only in Canada, in any Western country, that's what it's been. And now we're moving to this collaborative work. Well, when you put a bunch of individuals who are used to autonomy, their own preferences, etc., when they sit in a group, the first thing they experience is a feeling like they have to compromise, which is all about winning and losing. It's like my point, I'm going to stick to it, or I'm going to give in and just do what everybody wants me to do. So neither feels very good, but it's usually a first stage in learning to work together. Then comes cooperation, where we're kind of nice to each other, and maybe we get a little bit farther along in our thinking, or we can't actually agree on something. And then comes collaboration. Collaboration takes a lot of skill. Collaboration is a deep process that is not about compromising, and it's not about 100% consensus. It's about using evidence and data and working on a project and looking to see what's working and trying it again and all those kinds of things. So this adult path is mirrored in the classroom. You see the same thing with kids. They will compete with each other. They want a star. They want, then if you put them in groups, you'll see kids backing off and kids dominating. Maybe you'll get to some cooperative language, and then eventually you get to collaboration, if you're paying attention to those things. So I'm always thinking on two levels. I'm thinking always about, how do adults operate? What kind of feedback are we giving each other? Are we willing to receive? And then what does it look like in the classroom? When we cultivate our own habits, they show up in the classroom, and they raise the bar for what's actually going on in the classroom.
Okay. All right, so I liked her conversation there about just this idea, well, and to think about it in terms of our own experiences with collaboration, and how it is not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. So most of you in your posts were talking about how that conversation that you witnessed in the opening segment, how there had to have been a lot of preparation to get students for that. So what I want us to think about then is, we all have different teaching contexts. We all have different needs, different personalities. And so what I want us to continue to consider is how we can use the knowledge we gain through this class to really improve our students, our use of student-centered oriented discussion, and how we can work towards that in our own classrooms. And maybe as you're working in your discipline or in your planning assignment, that's something that you're going to be looking at. All right. Thank you. And I will talk to you next. Cool.